On February 25, 1947, four men sat down in a conference room in Berlin and signed a document that erased a state from existence. Not through surrender, not through merger, through law. Control Council Law Number 46 declared that the state of Prussia, which had dominated European politics for 2 centuries, had ceased to exist, not would cease, had ceased, past tense, as if history could be edited with a pen. The text was brief, fewer than 200 words. It stated that Prussia, from its earliest formation, had been a bearer of militarism and reaction, that the Allied powers, charged with reconstructing a peaceful Germany, found it necessary to eliminate Prussia entirely. Its territory would be redistributed, its government abolished, its assets transferred. Even its name would carry no legal weight. A Prussian citizen signing a document after February 1947 was technically claiming citizenship in a country that no longer existed. The oddness of this becomes clear when you realize Germany had already surrendered nearly 2 years earlier. The Wehrmacht was gone. The Nazi state had collapsed. The occupation zones were functioning. Why, almost 2 years after victory, did the Allies need to pass a separate law killing Prussia? Because Prussia hadn't actually died in May 1945. When Germany capitulated, the Reich ceased to function. But Prussia, older than the Reich and embedded deeper, kept operating. In the Soviet and British zones, Prussian bureaucrats still processed marriage licenses under Prussian legal codes. Provincial boundaries drawn by Prussian kings still appeared on administrative maps. Courthouses in Brandenburg used Prussian procedure. In some towns, clerks still stamped documents with seals bearing the Prussian eagle. The state had no central government, no army, no foreign ministry. But in the veins of local administration, Prussia was alive. The Allies noticed this problem at Potsdam in the summer of 1945. Truman, Stalin, Churchill, and Attlee gathered to carve up post-war Europe, and among the many decisions recorded in the protocol was a single line. The Allied Control Council would ensure the abolition of Prussia. No detailed plan, no timeline, just an agreement that Prussia, as a political entity, could not continue. But agreement in principle and action on the ground are different animals. Each occupying power interpreted abolition differently, and their interests didn't align. The Soviets wanted Prussia gone for ideological reasons. Marxist historiography held that Prussian militarism had incubated fascism, that the Junker landlord class of East Prussia had funded Hitler and staffed his officer corps. Erase Prussia, and you erase the reactionary base. But the Soviets also wanted Prussian state assets. Factories, railways, administrative buildings. If Prussia ceased to exist, those assets became war booty. Soviet legal teams started drafting claims before the ink dried at Potsdam. The British had ruled the Rhineland and Westphalia, both Prussian provinces, since the First World War. They understood that abolishing Prussia meant creating something new in its place, and they weren't sure what that should look like. Combine provinces into larger units, let regional identities re-emerge. The British military government favored pragmatic reorganization over symbolic gestures. Abolition could wait until the structures were ready. The French saw an opportunity. France had been invaded 3 times in 70 years, twice by Prussian-led armies. If Prussia disappeared, the Eastern threat weakened. But France also wanted territorial guarantees and reparations. Abolishing Prussia was fine as long as it came with enforceable borders and economic compensation. The Americans were the least invested in Prussia specifically. Washington's concern was preventing future German aggression, and that meant decentralization. Whether the old states were called Prussia or something else mattered less than ensuring no single German entity could rearm. American officials viewed Law 46 as part of a broader toolkit: disarmament, denazification, demilitarization. Abolition was one item on a long checklist, so Prussia lingered in a strange twilight through 1945 and into 46, legally ambiguous, functionally fragmented, but not yet dead, and then the territory started disappearing. The Potsdam Agreement had established the Oder-Neisse line as Poland's new western border. Everything east of those rivers, formerly German, became Polish or Soviet. That included the core of historical Prussia, East Prussia itself, Pomerania, and Silesia. Provinces that had been Prussian for centuries were now subject to a different sovereignty, not occupied, transferred permanently. This wasn't a border adjustment, it was territorial surgery, and it required moving people. Starting in late 1945, German populations in the transferred territories were expelled. 12 million people, most of them Prussian by identity and residency, forced westward into the shattered remains of Germany. The expulsions were chaotic and brutal. Families given hours to pack. Entire towns emptied. Trains and carts overloaded with refugees. Winters were harsh. Thousands died in transit. By the spring of 1946, East Prussia as a geographic and demographic reality had ceased to exist. The northern half, including the city of Königsberg, was annexed by the Soviet Union. The southern half became part of Poland. German place names were replaced. Königsberg would eventually be renamed Kaliningrad. Danzig became Gdansk. Breslau became Wrocław. The linguistic map was redrawn along with the political one. But even as Prussia's heartland was carved up and its people scattered, the legal entity persisted in the western zones. Prussian Westphalia and the Rhineland remained under British control, functioning as administrative units. Brandenburg, though fragmented, retained its Prussian legal identity under Soviet authority. The expulsions had destroyed Prussia's demographic base, but the name and structures survived in official use. This created practical problems. Refugees arriving in Bavaria or the Rhineland still carried documents identifying them as Prussian citizens. Property disputes in the western zones were adjudicated under Prussian civil codes. Marriage and inheritance law defaulted to Prussian precedent. The state had no capital, no legislature, no executive, but its legal personality haunted the occupation. Allied administrators began to realize that destroying Prussia required more than redrawing maps and moving people. It required killing the legal fiction. As long as Prussia existed on paper, it existed. Documents could be cited, precedents invoked. A future German government could theoretically reconstitute Prussian provinces, reclaim Prussian assets, assert continuity with the pre-war state. The Allies had defeated Prussia militarily and dismembered it geographically. They had not abolished it juridically. And so the question came to the Control Council: what does it mean to abolish a state? The council, composed of the four occupying powers, met regularly in Berlin to coordinate policy across zones. By late 1946, abolishing Prussia had been on the agenda for over a year, but no action had been taken. Disagreements over reparations, asset distribution, and the legal mechanics of abolition stalled progress. The Soviets insisted that Prussian state property in their zone should be declared Soviet property outright. The Western Allies resisted, arguing that assets should be allocated by a transparent formula. France wanted Prussian debts nullified. Britain wanted legal clarity on successor entities. The debates were technical and bitter. Staff attorneys drafted language, revised it, discarded it. At one point, the American delegation proposed simply declaring Prussia a defunct entity without specifying consequences. The Soviets rejected this as toothless. The French countered with a proposal to criminalize Prussian identity. The British called that unenforceable. What emerged slowly was a compromise built on negation. Prussia would be declared to have ceased to exist, both de facto and de jure. Its territory, already divided, would be formally redistributed to successor states. Its governmental functions would be transferred to occupation authorities and later to German Länder. Its assets would be allocated by zone, with each occupying power administering former Prussian property within its jurisdiction. Its debts would be nullified, meaning creditors had no legal recourse. The legal language took months to finalize. Every word mattered because this wasn't a treaty between equals or a domestic law passed by a parliament. This was an occupying authority legislating the non-existence of a polity that had survived for centuries. The drafters had no precedent to follow. No major European state had ever been abolished by international decree. Partitioned, yes. Absorbed through conquest or dynastic merger, certainly, but declared legally void by external powers while millions of its former citizens still lived. That was new, and it raised uncomfortable questions. If Prussia no longer existed, what happened to Prussian law? Marriage contracts, property deeds, court judgments, all had been issued under Prussian authority. Did they remain valid? If Prussia's debts were nullified, did that apply retroactively? Could a widow in Hamburg claim a pension from a Prussian state fund that no longer legally existed? Could a factory in the Ruhr enforce a contract signed under Prussian commercial code? The Control Council's legal advisors drafted supplementary clauses to address these problems. Existing legal relationships would be honored unless they conflicted with occupation policy. Successor states would assume responsibility for ongoing administrative functions. Private property rights would be preserved, though this meant little in the Soviet zone, where property itself was being collectivized. Pensions and state obligations would transfer to whichever occupation authority or German land now controlled the relevant territory. But even with these provisions, ambiguities remained. The Soviets wanted broad discretion to reinterpret Prussian law as they saw fit. The Western Allies wanted continuity to prevent chaos. The compromise was vague by necessity. Prussian legal structures would continue to the extent that they served occupation objectives and did not contradict Allied directives. By early 1947, the draft was ready. The formal title was Control Council Law No. 46. It consisted of 2 articles. Article 1 stated that the Prussian state, its central government, and all its agencies were abolished. Article 2 provided that Prussian territory and assets would be disposed of according to decisions already made or to be made by the Allied Control Authority. That was it. Fewer than 100 words to terminate a state that had shaped European politics since the 18th century. The law was introduced at a Control Council session on February 20th. There was little debate. By this point, all 4 powers agreed on the necessity, even if they disagreed on the implications. The Soviets saw abolition as a tool to consolidate their control in the East. The Western Allies saw it as a symbolic repudiation of militarism. France saw it as insurance against future German aggression. Britain saw it as administrative tidiness. 5 days later, the law was signed. The ceremony was brief. No speeches, no commentary. The representatives affixed their signatures, the document was filed, and the session moved on to other business. Prussia, the kingdom that had unified Germany under Bismarck, the military state that had dominated the German Empire, the symbolic heartland of Junker conservatism and Prussian discipline, was now legally non-existent. But signing a law and enforcing it are different tasks. In the immediate aftermath, very little changed on the ground. Bureaucrats in former Prussian territories continued using the same forms, the same procedures, the same filing systems. In the British zone, local governments in Westphalia and Hanover still reference Prussian administrative codes because no replacement codes had been issued. In the Soviet zone, officials rewrote documents to remove Prussian references, but the underlying structures remained. The state had been abolished in Berlin. Now it had to be abolished in practice. The most visible changes came in naming. Cities, streets, and institutions that carried Prussian names were systematically renamed. Königsberg, the historic Prussian capital in East Prussia, had already been occupied by the Soviets and emptied of Germans. On July 4, 1946, it was officially renamed Kaliningrad after Mikhail Kalinin, a Soviet leader. By 1947, the renaming was complete. No trace of the German or Prussian name remained on official maps. Other cities followed. Breslau, a major Prussian city in Silesia, had been transferred to Poland and renamed Wrocław. Stettin became Szczecin. Danzig had become Gdansk. The renaming wasn't merely symbolic. It signaled that these cities were no longer German or Prussian. They were Polish or Soviet, and their German past was being overwritten. In West Germany, the renaming was subtler but equally deliberate. Streets named after Prussian kings or military leaders were changed. Frederick the Great boulevards became democracy avenues. Monuments to Prussian victories were removed or recontextualized. In some cities, local authorities resisted, arguing that Prussian history wasn't inherently militaristic, but Allied military governments overruled them. The directive was clear: erase Prussian identity from public space. The abolition also required creating successor entities. Prussia had been massive. It covered 2/3 of pre-war Germany's territory and contained most of its population. Something had to replace it. In the British zone, the solution was to merge Prussian provinces with neighboring territories to form new states. The Prussian Rhineland was combined with Westphalia and the small state of Lippe to create North Rhine-Westphalia. Hanover, Brunswick, Oldenburg, and the Prussian province of Hanover were merged into Lower Saxony. These new Länder were deliberately designed to dilute Prussian identity. No single state could claim to be Prussia's heir. In the American zone, Prussian territories were smaller and already fragmented. Hesse incorporated some former Prussian areas. Bavaria absorbed others. The Americans, less concerned with Prussian symbolism than the British, focused on administrative efficiency. Their goal was to create states that could govern themselves once the occupation ended. In the French zone, which included no major Prussian territories, the issue was less pressing. France supported abolition, but had little direct stake in implementation. In the Soviet zone, the approach was more radical. The Soviets didn't create new Länder in the Western sense. Instead, they established a centralized administration that would later become East Germany. Former Prussian provinces like Brandenburg and Saxony were acknowledged as administrative units, but they had no real autonomy. The Soviet goal wasn't to replace Prussia with new states. It was to replace German federalism entirely with a centralized socialist structure. By 1949, the process was largely complete. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in the Western zones, was organized into Länder that bore no resemblance to Prussia. The German Democratic Republic, established in the Soviet zone, was even more distant from Prussian structures. Both German states' constitutions omitted any reference to Prussia. The legal void was formalized, but abolishing a state's legal existence doesn't abolish the identity of its people. Millions of Germans still thought of themselves as Prussian. Refugees from East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia carried that identity with them into exile. They formed expellee organizations, published memoirs, held reunions. In West Germany, these groups were tolerated as cultural associations. In East Germany, they were suppressed as reactionary. The East German government treated Prussian identity as ideologically suspect, a relic of the militaristic past that socialism was supposed to overcome. For younger Germans born after the war or too young to remember Prussia as a functioning state, the identity faded. They grew up as citizens of Bavaria, North Rhine-Westphalia, or Saxony. Prussia became history, not lived experience, and yet the ghost of Prussia persisted in ways the Allies hadn't anticipated. Historians began debating Prussia's legacy. Some argued that Prussian militarism led directly to Nazism, that the authoritarian culture of obedience, the cult of the officer class, and the glorification of the state created the conditions for Hitler's rise. Others countered that Prussia had a reformist tradition, that 19th century Prussian leaders had modernized education and administration, and that blaming Prussia for Nazism was overly simplistic. These debates were more than academic. They shaped how Germans understood their own history. In West Germany, the discourse was pluralistic. Some condemned Prussia, others defended it. Most acknowledged complexity. In East Germany, the official line was unambiguous. Prussia was reactionary, militaristic, and incompatible with socialism. The East German states even demolished the Berlin Palace, a symbol of Prussian monarchy, in 1950, replacing it with a socialist plaza. The abolition also had unintended legal consequences. Disputes over property, pensions, and inheritance claims dragged through courts for decades. A woman whose family estate had been in East Prussia, now part of the Soviet Union, couldn't legally reclaim it because the state that had granted the property rights no longer existed. A veteran seeking a Prussian military pension had no institution to petition. These cases revealed the limits of legal abolition. You can declare a state non-existent, but you can't erase every relationship and obligation it created. By the 1950s, Prussia had become a historiographical and cultural problem rather than a political one. The state was gone. The territory had been redistributed. The institutions had been dissolved or absorbed. The name had been suppressed. What remained was memory, contested and fragmented, and that memory became a tool in Cold War politics. West Germany used the expellees' grievances to criticize Soviet territorial annexations. East Germany used anti-Prussian rhetoric to position itself as the anti-fascist German state. Both used Prussia's absence to define themselves, West Germany as a federal democracy that rejected centralized militarism, East Germany as a socialist state that broke with reactionary tradition. The abolition succeeded in its immediate goal. Prussia did not return. No political movement emerged to restore the Prussian state. No government claimed Prussian legitimacy. The territorial changes proved permanent. When Germany reunified in 1990, the former Prussian territories in Poland and Russia remained Polish and Russian. No serious proposal was made to reverse the Oder-Neisse line, but the symbolic question lingered. What had been abolished, a state structure or an identity? The answer depended on who you asked and when. In the immediate post-war years, the abolition was treated as administrative housekeeping. Control Council Law No. 46 was one document among hundreds issued by the occupying powers. It dissolved Prussian ministries, redistributed Prussian assets, and terminated Prussian legal personality. For most Germans in 1947, struggling with hunger and housing, the juridical status of Prussia was abstract. The real impact appeared in the paperwork. Marriage certificates in the British zone, which had referenced Prussian civil codes, now cited North Rhine-Westphalian law. Property disputes in Brandenburg, formerly adjudicated under Prussian statutes, were resolved under Soviet zonal regulations. University diplomas issued by institutions in Königsberg or Breslau lost official recognition when those cities became Kaliningrad and Wrocław. Prussian police pensions were recalculated or nullified. State debts owed by Prussia were declared void, which benefited some creditors and ruined others, depending on which successor entity assumed the obligation. The abolition created a legal vacuum that each occupation zone filled differently. The Western Allies encouraged federalism, new lender with distinct identities, designed to prevent the centralization that had characterized Prussia. The Soviets initially created 5 provinces in their zone, then steadily eroded their autonomy, replacing Prussian regional identity with socialist centralism. The irony was noted by some observers at the time. Prussia had been abolished for being too centralized and militaristic, and the Soviet zone was becoming both. The name itself became contested. In West Germany, Prussian appeared in historical scholarship and in the names of cultural institutions, museums, archives, libraries that preserved pre-war collections. But the term was politically sensitive. Conservative politicians occasionally invoked Prussian administrative efficiency or Prussian reform traditions as positive examples, which prompted fierce debate. Critics argued that rehabilitating any aspect of Prussian identity risked rehabilitating the militarism that had led to 2 world wars. In East Germany, the suppression was more systematic. Prussian symbolism was declared reactionary. The Prussian Academy of Sciences was renamed. Streets named after Prussian kings were given new designations. The most dramatic act came in 1950, when the East German government demolished the Berlin City Palace, the former residence of Prussian monarchs and German emperors. The building had been damaged during the war but was structurally salvageable. The decision to destroy it was ideological, not practical. The palace represented feudal and militarist tradition. Its removal was meant to signal a complete break with the Prussian past. The physical erasure extended to monuments and architecture across the Soviet zone. Statues of Frederick the Great were removed from public squares. Equestrian sculptures of Prussian military commanders were melted down or placed in storage. Buildings adorned with Prussian eagles had the emblems chiseled off or covered with plaster. The process was uneven. Some local officials were more zealous than others, and some structures were simply too large or too integrated into urban fabric to be easily altered, but the intent was clear. Meanwhile, the territories transferred to Poland and the Soviet Union underwent their own transformations. The Polish government faced the challenge of integrating lands that had been German for centuries. Cities were renamed, street signs were replaced, German-language inscriptions on buildings were painted over or removed. The new Polish population, many of them expellees from Poland's eastern territories, annexed by the Soviets, were encouraged to view these lands as historically Polish, recovered rather than acquired. This required a selective reading of history. The territories included regions that had been part of medieval Polish kingdoms, but had been under Prussian or German rule since the 18th century or earlier. The Polish state promoted narratives that emphasized early Slavic settlement and downplayed centuries of German presence. German cemeteries were neglected or destroyed. German churches were converted to Catholic use or repurposed as warehouses and workshops. The goal was to create a sense of continuity with a deeper past, skipping over the more recent Prussian and German period. In Kaliningrad, formerly Königsberg, the Sovietization was even more thorough. The remaining German population was expelled by 1948. The city was repopulated with Russians and other Soviet nationalities. German architecture that survived the war, including the heavily damaged Königsberg Castle, was left to decay and eventually demolished. The city was rebuilt in Soviet style, with prefabricated apartment blocks and wide avenues designed for military parades. The regional identity became Soviet, not Prussian. Kaliningrad Oblast was a closed military zone for much of the Cold War, inaccessible to foreigners and even to most Soviet citizens without special permits. The expellees from these territories, numbering in the millions, became a political constituency in West Germany. They formed organizations to preserve their regional identities, Silesians, East Prussians, Pomeranians, and to advocate for the right of return or compensation. These groups were controversial. Some focused on cultural preservation, publishing memoirs, maintaining regional dialects, holding annual gatherings. Others made irredentist claims, arguing that the territorial transfers were illegal and should be reversed. West German politicians treated the expellee organizations with caution. The organizations represented a significant voting bloc, and no major party wanted to alienate them. But their demands conflicted with West Germany's efforts to build relationships with Poland and to present itself as a peaceful, democratic state. The official West German position, maintained until the 1970s, was that the eastern borders were provisional, subject to negotiation in a final peace treaty. In practice, no serious plan existed to reclaim the territories. The legal ambiguity allowed West German leaders to avoid confronting the expellee organizations directly while quietly accepting the permanence of the post-war borders. The juridical question also had implications for state succession. When the Federal Republic of Germany was founded in 1949, it claimed to be the legal successor to the German Reich, though not to the Nazi regime. This created a complex relationship with Prussia. The Federal Republic accepted responsibility for certain obligations incurred by the Reich, including some debts and treaty commitments. But it did not claim to be Prussia's successor. Prussia had been abolished, and its functions had been distributed among the new Länder. The Federal Republic was constituted as a federation of those Länder, not as a continuation of any prior German state structure. This distinction mattered in reparations negotiations and property disputes. Polish and Soviet claims to former Prussian state property were based on the territorial transfers and the abolition law. West German counterclaims, when they existed, were based on private property rights, not on state succession. The Federal Republic did not argue that it owned former Prussian state assets in Poland or the Soviet Union because it did not claim to be Prussia. The German Democratic Republic, founded in the Soviet zone in 1949, also avoided claiming Prussian succession. The GDR positioned itself as a revolutionary break with German history, not a continuation. Its constitution made no reference to Prussia. Its legal system was based on Soviet models, not on Prussian or German codes. The GDR's relationship with the past was selective. It claimed the legacy of German anti-fascist resistance and socialist labor movements, but rejected Prussian militarism and Junker aristocracy. Yet Prussia remained unavoidable in historiography. Scholars in both German states grappled with how to interpret Prussian history. In West Germany, the debate centered on whether Prussian traditions of administration, education, and legal reform could be separated from Prussian militarism. Some historians argued for a nuanced view, that Prussia had produced both enlightened reformers and aggressive nationalists, and that its legacy was mixed. Others maintained that Prussian militarism was intrinsic, that the state's entire structure had been oriented toward war, and that any attempt to rehabilitate Prussian virtues was misguided. In East Germany, the dominant interpretation was Marxist. Prussian history was analyzed through class struggle. The Prussian state was portrayed as the tool of the Junker aristocracy, which had allied with industrial capitalists to suppress the working class and pursue imperialist expansion. This narrative fit the GDR's ideological framework, which positioned itself as the culmination of German working-class resistance. The abolition of Prussia was thus a victory for socialism, the elimination of a reactionary class state. These conflicting interpretations meant that Prussia's memory was contested, even as its political existence remained extinguished. The state had been abolished, but the argument over what it had represented and whether any part of its legacy was worth preserving continued for decades. By the 1980s, as Cold War tensions eased and historical scholarship became less ideologically constrained, a more complex picture of Prussia emerged. Historians examined regional variations within Prussia, the differences between the conservative Junker-dominated East and the more liberal Rhineland, the role of Prussian reformers in the early 19th century, the diversity of Prussian society. This scholarship did not rehabilitate Prussian militarism, but it resisted the simplification of Prussia into a purely reactionary or purely aggressive entity. When Germany reunified in 1990, the question of Prussia's legacy resurfaced briefly. Some conservative intellectuals argued for a renewed appreciation of Prussian administrative traditions. Some regional politicians in Brandenburg, which encompassed much of Prussia's historical core, expressed interest in reclaiming Prussian identity in a non-militaristic form. But these efforts gained little traction. The reunified Germany was committed to federalism and to integration with Europe. There was no appetite for reviving a centralized, Prussia-dominated state structure. The territorial question was settled definitively. The Treaty on the Final Settlement with respect to Germany, signed in 1990, recognized the Oder-Neisse line as Germany's permanent eastern border. Germany renounced any claims to former territories in Poland and Russia. The Expellee organizations, while still active, accepted that return was impossible. Compensation and reconciliation, not territorial revision, became the focus. Prussia's abolition had achieved its purpose. The state that had unified Germany, dominated its politics, and shaped its military culture did not return. The mechanisms that made that abolition effective were not solely juridical. The law mattered, but so did the territorial transfers, the population displacements, the destruction of symbols, the suppression of the name, and the construction of new identities in the successor states. The Allied powers had understood, even if imperfectly, that abolishing Prussia required more than defeating its army or dissolving its government. It required breaking the continuity, legal, territorial, demographic, and symbolic, that allowed a state to persist across generations. They achieved that break through a combination of coercion, legal engineering, and the material reshaping of borders and populations. Prussia remains abolished. No political entity claims its name or its legacy. The territories it once occupied are divided among Germany, Poland, and Russia, and none of those states shows interest in reviving Prussian identity.